morning, and thank you for being here, everyone. I saw that we had over 75 registrants for today's meeting, so I want to give a big shout out to those who worked on the agenda, especially our friends with the ICPRB, Christy, Sherry. We have ICPRB today actually presenting with Sherry. So just want to give a big shout out because there is a lot of work in preparation putting these agendas together. And I think we've got a great meeting today and appreciate everyone for being here. So also, I'd like to thank our speakers, Sam Dinkins and Jeff Swartfager. So I hope if I messed up your last name, Jeff, I apologize. Want to give you a big shout out as well because you're coming to us from outside of our watershed basin. And I know that that East Palestine will be of great interest. In Virginia, for the Virginia Department of Health, we're the ESF3 lead for water, wastewater, and dam safety. Our sister agency at the Department of Environmental Quality deals with ESF 10, Emergency Support Function 10, on the pollution response. And every day I get 5 to 10 hits of hazmat incidents throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia. And so I know this will be the same in other areas outside of Virginia as well on the hazmat incidents. And so we sometimes see train derailments. We sometimes see tanker trucks overturn, and we get thousands of gallons of milk, latex, coal, just various kinds of things that will spill and potentially affect our source waters. And so really excited about today's agenda for that reason, especially what we're going to learn from Sam and Jeff, who are going to give us our first presentation. And Sam, I think I'm going to turn it over to you. Sam is a technical program manager at the Ohio River Valley Water Sanitation Commission, or SENCO. He holds a BS in biology from Thomas More University and a master's in environmental science and policy from Johns Hopkins. And Jeff is the superintendent of the Water Quality and Treatment Division of the Greater Cincinnati Waterworks. His responsibilities include ensuring great water quality from source to tap, treatment in Cincinnati's 2 treatment plants, and distribution of the water throughout the Greater Cincinnati region. He has 32 years of experience with water quality and is responsible for maintaining compliance with our water quality regulations. He has a degree and a double major in biology and environmental science from Indiana University, a master's degree in environmental science from the University of Cincinnati, and holds a Class 4 water supply license from Ohio EPA. So with that, I will turn it over to you, and thank you very much, gentlemen.
All right, excellent. Thank you. We appreciate the opportunity to join this group and share a little bit about our experience dealing with the East Palestine train derailment. So in today's presentation, I'll go over some of the basics of the incident response and overview of that, talk a little bit about the data, and then finish up with kind of some of the challenges we faced and the lessons learned. This was a rather unique incident, and I guess maybe I want to start out by actually saying what I'm not going to talk about. And that is, in the end, this is a really large scale response effort. I'm focusing on, and as well as Jeff, on the areas that we specifically worked on, and that is the kind of the downstream monitoring of water quality. We were not, and I was not directly involved with the response in the immediate area. I mean, I was there, but we were not directly responsible for any of that response actually in the town of East Palestine. We were doing downstream water quality monitoring. And so I just want to, you would get some additional insights if you were speaking to, say, Ohio EPA, Pennsylvania DEP, West Virginia DEP, US EPA's regions 3 and 5 were all heavily involved in those areas. And so that's I want to point that out just before we get into it. So we can go ahead and advance the slide here. Actually, go one more, advance it one more, sorry. So I'm going to start out by just going through and somewhat of a timeline to talk about where we were at and how things progressed. And there will be some references to geographic areas that you may not be as familiar with, and I'll try to skip over those. I'm using some slides from some other presentations, and so I won't get into some of those nitty-gritty details, but we'll go from there. So anyhow, on February 3rd, late that evening, there was a train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio. The train itself had about 150 cars. 50 cars ultimately were either derailed or were heavily damaged in that incident. There were 10 hazardous material tanker cars involved in the derailment. And so our initial response, our initial notification was received from the National Response Center a little after 11 p.m. that evening. And essentially that initial report was, noted that there was a train derailment, that there was a fire, and that there was a potential release of unknown material. So at the beginning, which is very common in these sort of incidents, we didn't have a lot of information and weren't even sure if there was a release to water. And we are very focused at Orsanco as water quality folks. We don't do any of the air monitoring or anything of that nature. So we were very focused on that. Next slide. So when we get to the next day, Saturday, February 4th, we had information saying that there was, fire was still ongoing, but had diminished a bit from the previous night. At this point, we did know that there were vinyl chloride tanker cars that were involved in the derailment, and that there were other hazmat rail cars that also had burned. We still had unknown materials and unknown quantities released. By the early afternoon, we were aware that some of the local tributaries in the area, Sulphur Run and Leslie Run, had been impacted to some degree by runoff. A fish kill had been observed. And just to give you a geographic sense, this is East Palestine, Ohio. It's right on the border with Pennsylvania, so it's far eastern Ohio. And the incident location is roughly 19 stream miles from the Ohio River. And we focus primarily on the Ohio River itself, though we do sampling on the lower tributaries, lower reaches of the tributaries as well. And then that tributary enters the Ohio River it actually enters the Ohio River in Pennsylvania right before the Ohio travels into Ohio and West Virginia. And so that initially, when we received notice of the train derailment, we followed our normal protocols, which was to make notifications to drinking water utilities that may be impacted. So in this case, it included utilities from East Liverpool, Ohio, down to Weirton, West Virginia initially. That's roughly, East Liverpool, Ohio is on the Ohio River, about 20 miles downstream of the incident location. So that would be the nearest downstream drinking water, surface water system. And then we made those notifications another 25 miles or so downstream, just to make sure that they all had advance notice of the incident. We also, as our routine protocol would have us do, we sent out a spill report email that goes out to a much larger distribution list. So all utilities along the Ohio River would have been notified on that very first, on that February 4th. Next slide.
So, sorry.
Let me stop there for a second. Give Jeff an opportunity to speak here. Sorry.
Yeah. So my perspective on this, certainly, I mean, this is Sam's presentation, and he'll go over a much more detailed level on what happened during the response. But I just have a few times I'm going to interject just a little bit on to give a little perspective from a water quality, a drinking water. So I work for a drinking water utility and kind of give a little bit our perspective on it. And the first thing I just want to say is this notification from Orsanco is just extremely important. They have the responsibility, or they take on the responsibility of doing notifications about not just this spill, but any spill in our that can affect the Ohio River. So they go through all those spill reports and let us know what's happening. And it's especially important for us. We're a utility. I mean, we're 400 miles away from this spill. So otherwise, you know, if Forsenko we're not doing these type of notifications, there's not really a way for us to get information very, very timely to allow us to start reacting and getting all of our testing and all of our treatment and all that kind of stuff ready to respond to this spill. So by them fulfilling this role, it's extremely important for all water utilities in the Ohio Basin.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And so, yeah, so moving on, moving forward into the next day, Sunday, the February 5th. At this point, one of the interesting twists in all this is that there was a buildup of pressure in at least one of the vinyl chloride rail cars, and so that was creating some concerns there. US EPA and the responsible party were conducting water quality sampling in the creeks nearby. It was somewhat difficult. It was difficult. It was difficult to get information early on, and that's not uncommon. And given the complexity of this response, I think that exacerbated it. So here you have a situation where you have a significant air release or air concern because you have a fire and you have pressure building up, and you know, you have the risk of actual rail cars, you know, potentially you know, exploding essentially. But then you also have the side that we're working on, which is on the water quality side, and trying to get information about what's in the water. And so it did create some challenges in getting information early. On the February 5th, we were actually watching the press conferences the same as many other folks were doing, and getting some of our initial information that way, just because it was difficult to get that information otherwise early on. But yeah, so there had been a press conference on that February 5th indicating that some material, that the material was contained, and that at that point, none of the material had reached Little Beaver Creek, which is a few miles downstream from that incident location. Moving forward to February 6th, that's when we found, when we, and I say Orsenko, that's when Orsenko learned of the specific list, or at least a more specific list of what was in the rail cars. You know, that's not to say other parties involved with the response didn't already have this information, but on February 6th, we learned that there was vinyl chloride, which we knew about. Butyl acrylate was also present. Benzene residue. So a couple of the cars, I think, had previously carried benzene, and they just had the residual amounts in the bottom of those. And then combustible liquids, which was, you know, that's a pretty generic term, so it doesn't tell us a lot of specifics. We still at this point didn't know volumes released, but we did get word from Ohio EPA that some butyl acrylate did make it into the creek and escaped containment. So that was definitely something to make note of. And our nearest downstream monitoring station at Weirton, West Virginia, which is roughly 45 miles downstream of the incident location, we had an increase their sampling time to collecting samples every 2 hours. Typically, they collect about 4 samples in a day. This is a monitoring network that we have at numerous locations along the Ohio River, where they're collecting samples every day and running the samples on gas chromatographs to identify any potential volatiles that may be in the water that may be coming from a spill we know about, or possibly a spill that was unreported. So we did up the sampling frequency at that site to try to capture, if anything was detectable in the river, that we would have a good shot at collecting that leading edge. Jeff, do you have any comments here?
Yeah, just a couple. First of all, I'm actually not trying to bash first responders or anything like that, but just to reiterate a couple of things that Sam said so far is, you know, at the beginning, and this is true of any incident, a lot of times there's not information available. A lot of times there's misinformation. A lot of times there's just a lot of things that you want to know, but the information is just not available yet. And this is an instance, just to demonstrate that at the beginning of this incident, you know, we saw what was happening on the news, like Sam was talking about. You know, we saw the pictures like there was the shown there on the screen, and we contacted the Ohio EPA, about this, saying, what's happening there, what's going on. And we were told there was nothing, everything was contained, there was no runoff. And that was probably true at that point where we asked them, maybe there wasn't any runoff and stuff. But when it comes to emergency responses like that and emergency incidences, just be prepared that there's that you won't have the information that you need at the beginning. Also on here, on February 5th, water sampling was done in the creeks. But you got to remember, in an incident like this too, we didn't actually get the results back for another 4 or 5 days. So even though the sampling was done, we still had no idea what the results of that sampling was and what could have gotten into the creek and how much of anything could have gotten into the creek. So go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, those are all great points. Next slide, please. I'll just cover this really quick. So this is just a general map of the evacuation zones. When that picture on the previous slide showed a large black cloud emanating from the rail cars there, and that was when they had a controlled burn, vent and burn. And so this is the map of the evacuation zones. And I just want to give you an idea, showing this mainly to show the proximity of the incident to Pennsylvania. So that north-south line that kind of runs at a diagonal in the middle there, that's actually, I believe, the border between Ohio on the left-hand side and Pennsylvania on the right-hand side. And so the actual train derailment was literally a couple hundred yards from Pennsylvania. And so it definitely involved multiple states right off the bat, just from an air standpoint. And these were the evacuation zones that were established early on when they were doing that control release. Next slide. Moving forward to February 7th. So the way our commission works, we have a technical committee that meets 3 times a year. And it just so happened that on February 7th, our technical committee was meeting. And so I gave them a briefing at that point as to what was going on with this incident. And at that point, earlier in the day on February 7th, at that point, we had no detections observed at any of our monitoring stations on the Ohio River. And so that was all good news. But pretty much shortly after I gave that presentation is when we received notice of the first detection on the Ohio River. And that was at Weirton, West Virginia, 45 miles downstream of the incident location. The GC mass spec there did identify the compound as butyl acrylate. And this sample, so while we became aware of it on February 7th, the sample was actually collected February 6th at about 4 p.m. that day. So now at that point, we know we have something in the river that's detectable. Butyl acrylate, however, is something that our system's not calibrated for, and it's also not an analyte that we have standards to compare to. And so while we were getting detections, we didn't really know what that meant in the context of human health risk. At this point, we went through another round of notifications, notifying all the surface water utilities from East Liverpool down to Wheeling. So now we're talking all the utilities 70 plus miles downstream of the incident location received phone notifications, and we then send out another email to the full distribution list just to make sure folks were aware of it. At this point, we also activated a field sampling crew to get up there and to start water quality sampling. Next slide. And this is just a graphic here showing the actual detection. That green arrow is kind of showing that butyl acrylate peak on the gas chromatogram there. And so this is what our chemists looked at and noticed that we had a detection, and that indeed the mass spec was able to give a pretty strong identification that it was butyl acrylate. Next slide.
So, yeah, well, I just want to point out just a couple of things at this point. So we're at February 7th, 3-4 days out of the spill. And I just want to say how important this organics detection system is by Orsenko. So although there was sampling done by the EPA, I believe it's on the 4th, we still don't have any of those results back yet. So the first time that we actually saw what was in the water, what could have been there, was at a drinking water intake actually, and was what Sam's talking about. It was picked up by their machines that they had monitoring there. So that was, it's extremely important, not only for the people there at that utility, but everybody else downstream of the utility and downstream on the Ohio River, because now we know maybe what we know we're dealing with something. We know something's there. We have a good indication of what that something could be. So now we can start looking at, start trying to figure out, can we treat for this compound? What is the treatment for this compound? Can we test for it? What are the methods to be able to do that kind of stuff? And really, that help us to focus our efforts now. So instead of just saying, well, there's something maybe out there somewhere at some unknown concentration, now we start to see what we're dealing with, and we're able to start getting a response now for this compound. So I saw Ann. I think Ann had a comment a little bit earlier about about there not being this type of system. I think in the Chesapeake Bay or in your area, but having just having that on the Ohio River is just not only in this instance, but in many incidences every year. It's really helped us to be able to get an early warning of what's out there.
Yep. Great points. Next slide, please. And so moving forward, so as Jeff was just mentioning, talking about the water quality sampling, when we got to February 8th and we had that field crew mobilized and in position to collect samples, of course, then we have to say, well, where are we going to get these samples analyzed? And so with that, we started collecting samples in triplicate. And I guess technically we actually were collecting 4 samples at a site because we had an extra oops factor sample just in case something broke or something went awry. So we actually were collecting 4. But essentially what we were doing is we would collect one sample, or we would take one sample from a site and take it to our nearest organics detection system. That's what the ODS stands for, Organics Detection System. And that's the monitoring network we've been referring to. So we would take that to the nearest local ODS site. One sample would go to GCWW, which is Greater Cincinnati Waterworks, which is Jeff's utility there. And then we also would bring back one additional sample for Orsenco to run at our main office here in Cincinnati. So we were generating a lot of data through all this. But if you think about that, at this point, this incident is 400 miles upstream of Cincinnati, and we have Greater Cincinnati Waterworks actually playing a lead role in actually analyzing these samples, which is very, very proactive on their part, and we definitely appreciate their role and effort in all of this. At this point, we also sent a second crew up to the incident area, mainly to provide some direct engagement at the Incident Command Center, and also provide some additional assistance in sampling and whatnot. This is the day, so we're 4.5 days into this. This is the day that Orsenco received the train manifest with a complete listing of everything that was included on the train. And as I mentioned earlier, our system was not calibrated, and neither was pretty much anybody's system was calibrated for butyl acrylate. It's not something that's part of the standard suite of analytes. And so this is the day we ordered our standard, and fortunately we were able to get it overnight. I believe Greater Cincinnati was able to, they worked closely with US EPA and were able to get a standard rather quickly, maybe even same day. Is that correct, Jeff?
Yeah, we were, so this is a standard that we don't have on hand. So when we found out from the ODS system what we were dealing with in the river, we went in and called all of our friends, anybody that we knew that may have something like this. And it just so happens that the US EPA has their National Water Research Center here in Cincinnati. And we called up some people we knew there, just asking anybody, do you have butyl acrylate? Can you give us a standard? Can we get some of this from you to help both in analytics, but also start to do treatment studies now? And fortunately, we did find one of our colleagues over there had some, and we were able to get some of the butyl acrylate and start that kind of work there on February 8th.
Great. All right, and next slide, please. And so February 9th, 10th, we continued to do our monitoring that we were doing, met with folks at we met the various response agencies and the responsible party at the command center. Sampling continued from close to the incident location, sampling Little Beaver Creek, but also extending that sampling further downstream, some 70 miles downstream, actually, on those early days, sampling at the various utilities in that stretch. At this point, West Virginia water intakes had been shut down because we were getting detections, but at this point, we didn't know what was a level of concern. West Virginia chose to take a proactive approach here and to request that those intakes be shut down at least temporarily. And as soon as you shut utilities down, then you have to say, well, what's the criteria for reopening? And I believe they came up with 2 consecutive non-detects in their finished water to reopen. So we were providing, in addition to do our normal river sampling, the network, our organic detection system, was being used to run finished water samples, which we don't typically run on these instruments, but running finished water samples to confirm that they had non-detects in their finished water, and that was not a problem in terms. I mean, they were not seeing anything in the finished water, so that was ultimately not a problem for reopening, but it was something that had to be addressed. And I'll fast forward to February 11th. Then I mentioned we didn't have health guidance values early on in this. February 11th, so we're 7.5 days into it, is when ATSDR released human health guidance values for both butyl acrylate and ethyl hexyl acrylate. And this was a moment of relief for most of us in the response, because the types of levels we were seeing were typically single-digit part per billion. And the health guidance values were 560 for butyl acrylate and 500 micrograms per liter for the ethyl hexyl acrylate. So we, at that moment, were like breathing a sigh of relief. Next slide, please.
Wait, before you go up there.
Yep.
So on February 9th was also the day that we finally got the results of all the EPA testing there on site, which was great, because having that test, the test results from there, it reiterated it validated what we were seeing with the in our other water testing, that it was butyl acrylate was a compound of interest. And some of the tests, like up near the site, we also saw the 2-ethyl hexyl acrylate, but that gave us a lot of confidence of what we were testing for. We were testing for the right things, the testing that we were doing, and our response geared towards those 2 compounds. We were on the right track. So we were really glad to, even though those results did come a few days later than we would have wanted them, it was really great to have those results to just to validate what we were doing. Also in that time period, the February 9th and 10th and 11th, we were able to get, since we got some of the standard of the butyl acrylate from our colleagues at USEPA, we were able to do treatment studies to figure out how to treat for this. How can you treat for this and remove that compound? And we were able to find that actually one treatment, adding a compound called potassium permanganate into the water, which a lot of utilities on Ohio River actually do. By adding that to the water, that actually reacts really well to break down the butyl acrylate. So when Sam was talking about some of the upstream utilities not having detections in their finished water, it was because of that treatment that they were using that was able to break down the butyl acrylate. So we're very fortunate there that compound was so amenable to be destroyed by the methods we already were, or a lot of utilities were already employing on the river.
Great. Next slide. This is just an example of what we were basically producing each day of this response, with a map that showed the various sampling points. And the area that's outlined in red is the area that we sampled for that given date. So February 10th, this is where we sampled. and it has a little table next to it showing the specific mile points, locations, dates, times. And this data set was simply showing presence, absence. The quantifiable data were samples that were being generated by Greater Cincinnati Waterworks as they were up and running with calibrated system. And so our local ODS site was not fully calibrated for it yet, and so we were simply reporting at this point in time presence and absence, not actual quantifiable concentrations. Next slide. And from February 11th to February 19th, we transitioned to making sure the plume was moving downstream at this point. We're trying to make sure we're capturing where the leading edge was, because there was a lot of interest in from utilities and from politicians and whatnot. Anybody and everybody in the media want to know where is it right now. And so it was getting harder to cover the whole stretch of the plume. And so we started focusing, trying to make sure we had the leading edge, but also going further back towards the incident location to get a handle how far this is spread out. We sampled anywhere from 50 miles to 120 miles in a day. Early on in this response, with the water stream velocities, the river was flowing roughly 1 mile an hour, so you're getting about 25 miles in a day. Later on, due to some precipitation, stream velocities in Cincinnati actually increased to nearly 4 miles an hour, and so now you're looking at 100 miles in a day. So it definitely spread out pretty quick once the velocities increased. But our daily routine was simply, it was essentially this. During the daytime, you go out and you collect the samples. Evening, you drop samples off at the nearest organic detection system location. You would have a runner get samples over to Greater Cincinnati Waterworks, and then by late that night, we would get from the samples that we dropped off at the local ODS lab, we would get those initial results, which would be typically presence absence, or at least early on was presence absence. And then we would run our time of travel spill model to predict where it's going to be the following day. And then that's where we would direct our sampling crews on the next day. So it was each day's sampling was informed by the prior day's collections. And then, the quantifiable data would come the next day from Greater Cincinnati Waterworks. So that's kind of how the general process was working. Next. We continue to follow this thing down, even though we were getting really low, or not, in some cases, no detections. Drinking water utilities along the entire length of the river were really concerned about what they might be drawing in, and maybe I should say their customers were really concerned. Utilities for the entire length of the Ohio River. Ohio River is about 1,000 miles long. We had utilities 900 miles downstream of this incident location that were getting a lot of concerned customer calls. And so we continued to sample even after we were getting not consistent non-detects, just to provide the utilities some information so they had something to give to their customers as to what we know about where it's at, or we know that it's dropped below detectable quantity levels. And so we continue to sample. Markland Lock and Dam is probably about 500 miles downstream of the incident. Camden Lock and Dam is about 700 miles downstream of the incident location. Both of those were being collected for the benefit of Louisville, Kentucky, and Evansville, Indiana, their water systems, to give them some information and comfort that everything was looking good now in terms of not having detections. Next slide. And so at this point, we had sampled 700 miles of river, and we were feeling pretty strong and pretty good that we were kind of done with the field aspect of monitoring the Ohio River. And then the next day after we did actually the same day that we finished sampling at Camden Lock and Dam, we get a call from Ohio EPA saying they had a incident up there where they temporarily lost some containment, and due to high flow and precipitation there. And so we redeployed another crew to go up there and sample the next day on February 23rd. We did get hits for butyl acrylate, ethyl hexanol, and ethyl hexyl acrylate in the local tributaries there, but we really weren't. Those were all low level hits. Really weren't seeing anything in the Ohio River. And then in March and April, so at that point, at February 23rd, we kind of finished our special, intensive field monitoring. But we continued our routine monitoring, as we always do on a daily basis through our organic detection system. But in addition to that, we had additional samples collected at a number of utilities along the entire length of the river for 2 months, and collecting just one sample a week for 2 months at a number of utilities. They would send those samples in to us. We would analyze them and report those results back to them. And that was mainly to give the utilities something to point to say, look, there's not an issue. And this was largely driven because there was a huge public concern about what the potential was here. And this gave them something, some reassurance, and their customers some reassurance that all was good. Next slide. This is just a few photos and of the various response moments there. We can go ahead and fast forward past this. And next slide. So challenges and lessons learned, we'll cover those now. So as we mentioned earlier, limited and inaccurate information early on, that's very common in these types of situations. And this was no different, and we definitely struggled with getting good information early. This is my number 2. This is kind of an Orsenco specific one. We weren't in the loop for all the types of information sharing that was out there early on in this response, and so that created some hiccups with respect to how we responded and how quickly we got into position because of the lack of information. There wasn't a unified command, a full, complete unified command established early on. I'm sure there was a unified command of some sort, but it wasn't complete. There were not all the players involved early on. This incident, I guess, was somewhat unique in that, occurred on February 3rd. It became federalized about 2.5 weeks after the initial incident. Once it became federalized, it became very organized and coordinated in terms of a daily cycle for communications and phone calls to share information. But some of those early days, it was rather difficult. And so this would be one of the things that I definitely hope that we can do better in the future to get plugged into that for our own purposes, so that we can help inform the utilities, downstream utilities, as early as possible. One of the things that we struggled to get a coordinated sampling plan in place. At one point, early on, met at command center and said, okay, we really need to get the key monitoring agencies, the water quality monitoring agencies, on a call or direct face-to-face meeting, either way, to have a discussion on a coordinated sampling plan. By the time we had the call the next day, so I started out with my vision was having about 5 to maybe 7 people on a call to discuss this. Because like I said, we have Orsenco, we got Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Region 3, Region 5, all players here. The next day when we had the call that started out to be 5 to 7 people, morphed into a call with, I want to say, maybe 50 people. And we finished that call without a coordinated sampling plan, because that call took on a life of its own. And so that's something that I need to work on to help focus that a little better, so that we can get a coordinated sampling plan across agencies. As Jeff already mentioned, some of the social media stuff that was out there, some of it was very misleading and very scary to folks, and so it did create some alarm among residents, and far and wide. It wasn't limited to the East Palestine area or even locations along the main stem of the Ohio River. It extended throughout the basin, and in some cases well outside of the basin. I've been at meetings where I've heard people in Missouri talking about how they were receiving numerous calls. I heard somebody at a Region 5 meeting say that the Ministry of the Environment in Canada was receiving calls about this. So, I mean, you know, it really created a lot of concern there, and that was something that was very difficult to deal with. One of the things that we definitely found is many people really don't understand where their drinking water comes from. They just don't. You have water systems that are completely isolated away from the Ohio River, but they were concerned that their water could be contaminated, and so there's maybe something there to take away from trying to make sure that customers understand where their water is coming from in these type of incidents, so that there's not undue alarm in areas that really could not be affected. We were inundated, as was anybody, you know, heavily involved with this, inundated with information requests. Media and political interest was really significant. I'm not used to doing daily briefings to inform governors and senators. It's just not something normally that we deal with in spill responses, but that was the case in this situation. So it grabbed the public's attention to the point that there was a huge demand for information, and it took up a lot of time. And then the last one is kind of a side issue, but it did become an issue locally in East Palestine. One of the concerns was when they did the vent and burn of the vinyl chloride, that dioxin could be created as a byproduct when you burn vinyl chloride. Even though that was, you know, a secondary issue relative to the initial incident, and then some of the subsequent dioxin air plume modeling showed that the amount of dioxin created would have been very small. There were at public meetings in East Palestine where people had signs saying they're not sampling for the right thing, they're not sampling for dioxin. It became a real issue in that sense of dealing with the public perception that we weren't sampling or analyzing for the right things. And so we were a little slow in getting full messaging out on that issue. Jeff, did you have any other comments you want to add in here?
I just have to underscore that we were very unprepared for the amount of media request and the request for information coming out of this. I mean, so it wasn't just Orsenko, but so I ended up doing I think I ended up doing about like 27 or so press interviews, including CNN, about this. And it was something that if we had known that at the beginning of this incident that we would have gotten so much, we probably would have designated one person just to handle the media and handle the press. But it really creeped up on us. You know, every day there was a call, and then there was a call in the morning, and then maybe 2 or 3 or 4 calls in the afternoon from local TV stations and stuff. As you know, they were tracking this as it's coming towards Cincinnati as well, and they wanted our statements every day. So it took a lot of my time to do that kind of stuff, and that pulled me away from a lot of the more technical treatment running of the water plants type work that I should have been doing. So I know we'll get into the lessons learned a little bit later, but having somebody to deal with the press and having a plan to deal with it to allow you to still do your work is something really big, a big lessons learned for us as we went through this incident.
Great. Next slide. And I will say, like, at the peak of this, just to give you an idea, I went back and looked at my phone log and stuff. You know, I was probably dealing with, you know, 70 calls in a day, 100 emails, and countless text messages. That was just me. Coming into, and I was also trying to work at the same time. So it was a lot on a scale that I've been in this job for 28 years. And so I've never seen a response like this in terms of the intense interest. Some of the analytical challenges, as we've already talked about, initially unknown materials. So what do you test for? That's not an uncommon issue that we have in these types of releases. In this case, though, being that it was butyl acrylate, that was one of the things that was released. We weren't calibrated for it, and neither were most of the other labs. Actually, I'm not sure if any lab was calibrated for it initially. And so, you know, we needed to get standards right away. So that was something that you have to think about, or as early as you can, about getting those standards in-house so that you can calibrate for those. We had some really unusual detections at Wheeling ODS, or Organic Detection System location. What happened was we were getting detection, like the initial, we got our first detection at midnight, and then we weren't getting detections, and then we got it again, and then we weren't getting it. And that cycle repeated 2 days in a row, and that's where we made the connection to, what was going on at those two days in a row, that at midnight and 8 a.m. They got detections, but every other time of the day, every 2 hours we were sampling at Wheeling, they were not getting detections. And so we were trying to figure out what was going on, and that's when they revealed that those were the only 2 times that they collected samples in which they weren't pre-treating with potassium permanganate. And so that's kind of leads into what Jeff was mentioning earlier, where they were doing some testing, ultimately did some testing and learned that potassium permanganate was a good treatment technique to remove this from the drinking water. And then lastly, our organic detection system wasn't well understood by a number of the agencies. And so it did take me a lot of time to try to educate folks when I'm trying to explain what our monitoring system is. And really, it's a screening network. And it's not a state certified laboratory per se, but the intent is to get data quickly in the hands of decision makers like utilities and response agencies, so that they can make an informed decision on how to react to a particular situation. Next slide. Data challenges. What data do you distribute and publish? I mentioned we were running samples. Cincinnati Water's running samples. Our local ODS sites running samples. Most of our data was considered, like I said, screening. But the Greater Cincinnati Water Works data was they had a system that's better calibrated and do have certified lab folks there. And so in the end, what we were officially publishing was the data that was generated by Greater Cincinnati Water Works. However, we had additional information about, potential detections, or detections that were our chemists were confident it was actually there, but it technically was below the practical quantitation limit. That's the PQL, practical quantitation limit. And so we got into this whole issue of what do we report? And it became a bit of an issue. I mean, we literally had one situation where the West Virginia governor's office was calling, asking, hey, when's it going to get to this particular town, this particular water utility? And at the same time, I'm literally talking to that utility, and they're going, well, we just had a really slight hit, but it's below the PQL, so we're not sure, what to say about that. Is it actually here or not? And so it created this dilemma that you really don't want to have to sort that out in the heat of the moment. You really want to think about that ahead of time. Challenge also consistent messaging with our partners. That's going to always be a challenge, and so you just have to be proactive there and working through that. Just keeping up, talking about being inundated, keeping up with the sampling information, the mapping, analytical results. So those were challenges. And we did encounter some connectivity issues with our electronic devices and being able to communicate in the field. And so we want to make some improvements there as well. Next slide. Next slide. So I'll finish up here with lessons learned. Be proactive in getting information out, and incident details online. That's something that from my perspective, I feel like the story was, if you either write the story or it gets written for you. And so I think in some elements, the story was written for us because there wasn't enough information to satisfy the interest out there. And so just being proactive, that creates challenges too. So I'm not diminishing, that fact, but be as proactive as you can in that situation. I mentioned earlier, response agencies were really unfamiliar with our organic detection system, and so it did require some additional work to explain that and get through that, so that they were comfortable in what the results were showing. And so what we want to do is really develop a spill response toolbox. I mean, we have one of sorts already, but there are additional elements we want to make sure we do, including, standardized data collection reporting, whether it's forms or what have you, making sure everybody's up on the methodologies, and then just in general improve our spill response readiness with that spill response toolbox. We need to have a common understanding. This is something you want to have in advance. Common understanding regarding data reporting. I mean, like I said, screening level versus certified results. What do you do with when you have detections that your chemists are saying the GC mass spec is telling us butyl acrylate is there. It's just not above that PQL. How do you treat that? From a response, if you're talking about just a response element, you're going to use that as that's your leading edge, but is that something you're actually going to share with anybody beyond the internal response agency discussion and the local utilities? Next slide. And then I think this is the last slide here. Be very proactive in determining your engagement with the command center, trying to get involved as early as possible. Just because they say there's water quality sampling, I've made this mistake a couple of times where I'm inquiring, is water quality samples being collected? And the answer is yes. And so that that response kind of tells us, okay, maybe we don't, or Sanco doesn't need to directly inject ourselves into this. But you really have to ask the second question is, when will those results be available? And so if the answer is, yeah, we did sampling, but it's going to be days before we get results, for us, that means we just need to go collect our own samples so that we can get data quickly to help inform those utilities and response agencies. Our staff resources were really stretched to the limits. So we're going to do some additional cross-training to create some additional redundancy within our positions. This includes from the sampling side, GIS, data management, our organic detection system, instant command, personnel, and public information. So there's a lot of cross training that's needed there. We're a very small organization. We only have 22 staff members. So this was nearly all hands on deck throughout this process. Some of the groundwater systems, the SWIGs, I don't know if folks are familiar with the term SWIG, source water influenced groundwater systems. So there were a number of groundwater systems that are directly along the Ohio that became very interested in getting updates from us throughout this process. And so that's something we probably need to improve on. If you're dealing with unregulated materials that don't have human health guidance values, engage ATSDR right away and get them like in some cases, they already have work that's been completed. It just hasn't been published. Having those numbers as early as possible is extremely helpful. And then keep task management groups small. And that was kind of that example where I talked about getting that sampling plan developed, in that call that went from, a target of 5 people to 50 plus people. You really have to keep those management groups small for those specific tasks. Next slide. I think that's it. Jeff, did you have any additional comments you want to make there?
Yeah, I think just to reiterate the amount of time and effort to dealing with the public and dealing with the press there. If you see an incident is going to become big or starts to become big, make sure you plan for that and you plan you figure out how you're going to deal with that. But also, when Sam's talking about the results, how to handle the sample results and the sampling. Being with the water utility, I want results right away. I want results right away, and I'm willing to maybe really to maybe error on the side of detecting something rather than going through, as opposed to taking a lot of time doing all the QCs and all that kind of stuff that needs to be done. And I'm wording that very wrong. I don't mean that at all. But going into an incident like this, we need actionable data, things that we can take action on very quickly. And others within the response, they wanted something that was more defendable in a court, which takes a lot of time, takes a lot of oversight, takes a lot of review. And I think there really has to be a balance of that, or figuring out how to deal with that, how to satisfy both of those needs. Because certainly, you know, if we would have done all of our testing and would have taken 7 or 8 days to get results back, you know, that for us that would have been unacceptable. But later on, but there's definitely a need for that kind of scrutiny and that kind of those types of analyses too. So just kind of learning how to balance that is something else that maybe would be nice to be thought through when you're working with your emergency response agencies. Them getting to know your expectations for water utility people, your expectations, what you need, why you need the data that you do. So that kind of stuff can be incorporated into the emergency response as well. So with that, thank you, Sam. I think you did a great job for presenting what's happened there. And it was I think tomorrow marks the 6-month anniversary of the spill. So it's hard to believe that it's been 6 months since happened there, but I'm glad that it's over and we're past that now.
Yep. Thank you.
There's a question in the chat, and I just want to echo what Jeff said. Thank you both. That was fantastic. And yeah, I knew it would be because I've talked to Sam before, but thank you for taking the time to be with us. Priscilla Toe asked, how did you go about getting ASTDR involved, engaging them?
So the way it worked in this particular case was we were, you know, we had that interest in doing it, and our executive director actually contacted ATSDR initially, and then they came back and said they would need a formal request from a state agency. So the head of Ohio EPA made a formal request for that information for the butyl acrylate and in other compounds. And so essentially, once that formal request came from the state, I think we got it the next day. I mean, it was rather quick once that request was made. Now, saying that it's because they had already done, like, this was something that was already there, really. You know, they obviously didn't go out and do all the testing and evaluation in one day, but it just so happened that butyl acrylate was something they already had done a lot of work on.
And Sam, would you mind explaining, you've told me before, but I don't think you said it today, about the way the monitoring system is designed. So there is equipment at the utilities that utility employees run. Yeah, you go ahead.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So our organics detection system, we currently have 16 monitoring stations. Most of those are directly on the Ohio River, but some are on tributaries. The way it works is Orsenco owns the equipment in most cases. Greater Cincinnati is actually one of the sites that's different in this case. But for most of the sites, we own the equipment and we pay to maintain the equipment, and we also provide training to the water systems to operate. But on a day-to-day basis, these units are housed at the drinking water utilities, and water utility personnel are running the samples for us, for all of us, collectively, on a daily basis. And then they run those samples, and then we can tap into that network remotely to review the results and whatnot. Essentially, the sample, all the sites are gas chromatographs, but we have 3 different levels of gas chromatographs. We have them paired according to the size of the utility, the resources they have, the time they have, the you know, that sort of thing. And so we have kind of a low, an easier hands-off kind of GC mass spec that runs, and then we have all the way up to the, or sorry, that's just a GC, not with a mass spec. And then we have our high-end units as GC mass spec. And essentially every site is collecting samples every day, varying frequencies, but we do generate data every day for all of those stations as a sentinel system to make sure that we have a good handle on any unreported spills. And when we do have a known spill, we use it to track the progress of that plume downstream. And I mentioned Cincinnati being different. How Cincinnati is different is they actually own that. They chose to purchase their own. They have a lot of analytical capability, and own their own equipment and run it on their own expense. But they are members of this organic detection system network and share their information with other utilities and share, as Jeff mentioned earlier, the work that they do with, testing pretreatment options and those sort of things. So the network itself creates, it's not just that system from a daily monitoring, but it creates a known network that people know each other and can call each other when you have these incidents to share information.
Any other questions? These gentlemen worked around the clock for about 2 months. So please everyone take advantage of their expertise and experience here.
Sam, do you know if when the river intakes were shut down for a few days downstream, did the communities have finished storage water? Or finished storage, finished water in storage to supply to their residents? Sorry.
So that is a detail that I don't know as much about.
I can chime in there, Sam.
Sure.
So several of them did. A lot of them also had connections to adjacent systems and maybe a groundwater system or something like that. So anybody who was able to get water from another source, they went ahead and went on that other source. They used the work that Orsenko did. They had an ETA when it was going to get here, and just as importantly, when it would be gone from there. So anybody who did that. As a backup to that, then any system that wasn't able to do that, because of the work that we did, we found that a couple of treatment methods using potassium permanganate, using powder activated carbon, those were effective for removal of these compounds. So the systems then who couldn't shut down used those treatments to remove the contaminants from the water.
That's good to know. Thank you.
One thing I'd point out, so sometimes when we go and we are notified of an incident and we send out this email distribution to like all the utilities on the Ohio River, I know sometimes folks look at that and going, well, I mean, do you really need to tell a utility that's 500 miles downstream right now about this incident? But one of the things it does for you when you do give them that advance notice is if it turns out to be a large incident, it gives them time to fill reservoirs or what have you, make preparations so that they can mitigate any potential impacts.
Thank you. Thank you all. I don't know if you guys are off to do your other duties or hanging around in case there are anything else, but Sam's email address is here if anyone wants to follow up with him after the fact. We really appreciate your time this morning.
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, Dwayne, back to you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Great presentation. Most appreciated. I know that's a lot of work, and I couldn't imagine trying to go through everything that you guys were going through at the time, because I was watching it on CNN and all of the national news as well every day. And appreciate your hard work on it as well. Next up is Patty K. Wisniewski. She is with EPA Region 3, and Patty K, I claim you to be a rock star. So she is quite helpful, has always been responsive, and is proactively reaching out to me and others within the Virginia Department of Health, keeping us straight. So she's been with the EPA for 38 years, and she performs a wide range of duties, as well as one of those being keeping me in line. And she works on state grants, contracts management, drinking water rural development, resiliency, climate change. She has a Bachelor of Science degree in Environmental Science from Cook College, Rutgers University. Since 2002, she has been working on security and emergency preparedness and those things around that. And she also implements the America's Water Infrastructure Act, AWIA, and risk assessments and emergency response plans. So Patty K, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Dwayne. It's really good to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to share some other lessons learned from a spill. And I have to thank Sam and Jeff as well. I did not prepare some slides about issues and lessons learned, although we will talk about some of them, but I can guarantee you there are a lot of the same things that were on their lists. So let me see if I can pull up my slides here and show you. And if you could just
Good.
confirm, you can see them.
Yep.
Okay. Okay. So this morning I'm going to talk about the latex spill on the Delaware River. This happened back in March. So let me get into some of the specifics about what happened, and I can't seem to. There we go. This spill actually occurred late Friday night. Isn't that when most spills occur? Just before midnight. Let me see if I can't close this to keep it out of the screen. Thank you. There was actually a report from the National Response Center. There was a release of 90,000 pounds, and I looked this up this morning for you. That's roughly 8,100 gallons, although you know how these things go when spills first start out. A lot of unknowns, so it could have been as much as 12,000 gallons of this acrylic polymer from Trinzio. It's a facility in Bristol, Bucks County. I added a map to my slides this morning for those of you who aren't familiar with the Philadelphia area. So we had local and facility hazmat teams responded. Pennsylvania DEP also responded. The product initially entered secondary containment on site, but unfortunately that did not fully contain this material, and the product did reach a small creek known as Otter Creek and eventually into the Delaware River. And I'm just having trouble. There we go. So this incident is actually in the jurisdiction of the U.S. Coast Guard on the river. However, EPA duty officer was aware of this spill. They receive the reports from the National Response Center as well. So they were in contact with the facility, the Coast Guard, Pennsylvania DEP throughout the night and also throughout the weekend to offer support. I can tell you that even if it's Coast Guard jurisdiction, EPA likes to, and even if a state is responding, EPA likes to look over their shoulder, see what's going on, offer suggestions, push when we need to see something more happen. They'll raise some of those issues. And that certainly was happening in this case to see more actions being taken by the responsible party and in a quicker fashion as well. So during this response, there were several conference calls, which I'll get into the detail of, but the Coast Guard offered a boat to assist with sample collection on the river at the intake and several intakes and near the discharge. And the samples were actually collected by an EPA emergency response contractor. They joined the Coast Guard on the boat, picked up those samples, and then the responsible party actually transported those samples up to Eurofins in Edison, New Jersey, and paid for those analyses. So here's the map I promised. Philadelphia's down here. This is the Delaware River. Here's Bristol, which is where the facility is located. There are several intakes just below Bristol. There's actually an intake for Aqua above Bristol and another intake closer to Levittown. The utilities came together in a number of conference calls to share what was known. And one of the things that I think was really great about these calls was they were led by Pennsylvania DEP. And we'll talk quite a bit about their emergency responders being on site and handling these calls, and also the drinking water folks from Pennsylvania DEP, both central office and from the local regional office. And I think everyone coming together to have these calls. The water systems are a few in Pennsylvania, but there were also water systems in New Jersey. So ultimately these calls built to include county officials, New Jersey. We were keeping Region 2, EPA Region 2 out of New York, which handles New Jersey. We were keeping them informed from Region 3. So let me tell you a little bit more about the product, then I'll get into some of the response steps. This latex material dilutes in water, but it is also very visible as a milky substance. We were very fortunate, I think, in this case, to have a chemist from the company join some of our calls to be able to answer questions of the utilities. They wanted to know more about this material. Folks were concerned about its sticky nature. Was it going to stick to things? Was it going to stick to equipment? That was very much a concern. Being able to ask the chemist directly, who knew more about this material, was very helpful and reassuring, I think, to the utilities. And I find that to be rare. I've been involved in a number of spill responses where it's very rare for the water utilities to be able to talk to a responsible party. But in this case, they were more than willing to join the conference calls that we were having. ATSDR was mentioned earlier by Sam. We also reached out to ATSDR for some additional help because these are non-regulated parameters. We did not have health advisories. When I'm involved in a spill response, I look at other tools that EPA has. You may be familiar with WISIT, the Water Contaminant Information Tool. These parameters were not in that tool. So really the best information that we had was coming from ATSDR. I also share with you that there are a number of analytes that ATSDR has these reference concentrations, these screening levels. They do not publish them publicly, but they are available when needed for responses. We can reach out very easily to ATSDR. They have staff that sit in our EPA regional office in Philadelphia. We exercise with them, we train with them. When we're doing things just specifically related to water, we include them. It helps to raise their awareness of water, the concerns we would have when there are spills and other issues that could potentially impact water systems. So when I reached out to Rob from our office, who's with ATSDR, and it was Saturday night, I believe it was close to 11 o'clock Saturday night. He knew who I was. He knew, even though he wasn't at home and he was out doing other things, he answered the phone. And that I think is very critical in building those relationships before you need folks. Otherwise, if someone else in our program had called him, he may not have answered the phone if he didn't recognize a name. So someone asked about how to reach them. They do have a 24/7 duty officer based in Atlanta who can be reached. But it may be difficult for a water utility to get quick responses, especially if you need to have another agency making those requests. So if you need assistance, I'm a good contact. You could reach out to any of your source water folks from EPA to also reach me, but we can reach ATSDR. I know that our states also know how to reach ATSDR 24/7. But you can reach out to us. We're happy to reach out further. And I can tell you that when I reached out, I received information in less than an hour for those 3 acrylites that we were concerned with. And again, that was very useful information coming from the chemist at the facility. Now, as this event happened, this was actually happening overnight, Friday night into Saturday morning, there is a notification system known as the Delaware Valley Early Warning System. It is a system that covers the Delaware River, the Schuylkill River, really the Delaware Valley. Water systems are members. They receive these notifications. EPA receives them, DEP, the Coast Guard. Other folks can actually enter information that gets disseminated either through phone calls or through the website. So early on, many folks were aware that this had happened. Now on Saturday, what was probably the most useful thing to me was an EPA on-scene coordinator called me to alert me to a 2 o'clock phone call that was going to happen Saturday afternoon with the utilities that were potentially impacted and Pennsylvania DEP. This was highly useful because I'm not a responder, so I don't live with my phone attached to me. So this was extremely helpful to pull me into these discussions. We had several calls over the weekend. I believe we had 2 calls on Saturday, and I believe we had 3 on Sunday. Each time we had a call, it was to hear what are the concerns, what are the sampling results. We scheduled the next call when we knew we would have sampling results coming in so that the results could be shared and discussed with utilities. Again, I mentioned there were a couple utilities in Pennsylvania and a couple utilities in New Jersey American specifically. Burlington City was on the calls because they were concerned about whether or not they could be impacted. Aqua has a plant in Bristol, just north of where the spill occurred, but they were actively involved in the calls as well because of the fact that the Delaware River is tidal from the bay to Trenton. And we carefully watch the river, especially during periods of drought, because we watch the salt line as it comes north. And it has gotten close enough to be levels of concern for Philly water. But it's tidal, and that's important to know about the Delaware River. We know that Pennsylvania DEP had emergency response personnel on site at Trinzio to talk to the responsible party, to watch what they were doing in terms of stopping the discharge, cleanup, and Pennsylvania DEP emergency response personnel. Actually, I'll mention Brian Moore specifically. He's head of emergency response in DEP. He handled these, managed these conference calls with us, with the utilities, even though he was still responding to East Palestine. So he was a very busy man that particular weekend, but he usually is. And as I mentioned, we had the chemist online. So we were able to bring all the folks together. These calls were more organized than most calls I've been involved with when it comes to spill responses. And I think Sam alluded to this. You have so many people, so many issues, so many questions that come up. These were well led. They stuck to the issues. Certainly opportunity for the water utilities to speak, ask questions. They didn't last more than an hour. They were very productive calls. And I can't stress that enough. And I think it stems from the way they were kicked off by Brian Moore from Pennsylvania DEP Emergency Response. So I thought I would share this picture with you. On the left side of the screen is actually the spill material, the latex hugging the west shore of the Delaware River. That was Saturday afternoon. The picture on the right, this is the same bridge, the Tacony Bridge, and that's Sunday afternoon, and you can no longer see that material on the shore. These pictures were taken by the New Jersey American. They sent a drone up to look for the materials. We also know the Coast Guard was out looking for materials on the river. By Sunday, you couldn't see the same that you could see on Saturday, but there were small pockets that they were working to have cleaned up. I wanted to share this. This is off of Philadelphia Water's website. This is their this is their raw water basin at their Baxter treatment plant on the Delaware River. I share this because they do not have your usual intake that most of you may be aware of. This is a raw water basin, and they bring water in right from the river to this basin. Let it sit there, let it settle. And this became important to share during the calls, in fact, because folks from DEP Emergency Response, folks from DEP's drinking water program in central office in Harrisburg have never been to this plant. Showing them this was sort of an aha moment to them, like, oh, they don't have a usual intake. They can't necessarily raise or lower their intake like you can during some spills to avoid bringing in the material that has spilled, depending on where it is in the water column. So I wanted to share that with you because it is unique. So as I've mentioned, we had a number of conference calls with the responders, our responders from EPA, the states, the utilities, And I believe it's very important to bring the drinking water folks at EPA into these discussions early on. It saves everyone time and it gives us the big picture, and we can be there as a resource. We like to stay involved and informed even when the state has the lead, and in most cases, because they have primacy for the drinking water program, our states are going to have the lead when it comes to working with the water utilities. But including us is extremely helpful. It saves the state time in that they do not have to, come back to us, fill us in at some later time about what's going on, because we're going to get calls just like they will from the media. So we can be a technical resource about operations, about any regulatory requirements. And certainly, as was mentioned before, when we are dealing with unregulated parameters under the Safe Drinking Water Act, we can coordinate with ATSDR for these screening levels. So it's very helpful to have that information to inform the water systems, making sure that we're dealing with the right lab methods, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, but to bring everybody together, and these very useful calls, very productive. As I mentioned, some of the tools that we have available, they're not always useful, but it doesn't hurt to check them to see what kind of information you can find about the parameters of concern when there is a spill. Some of the things that we did in conjunction with Pennsylvania DEP, we reviewed sampling plans. To be honest, when a state is the lead, we will refrain from creating such a plan. It's not our role to do that, but we certainly will look at sampling plans to see if we can offer any other suggestions or recommendations about when the sampling is occurring, where it's occurring. In this case, as I mentioned before, the EPA contractor with the assistance of the Coast Guard were sampling in the river. There was other sampling occurring throughout the treatment plant by Philadelphia Water. They were looking at various points in their treatment process. EPA can help to collect drinking water samples of finished water. The drinking water program would not go out on the river to take raw water samples from the river. That is not something we're trained to do. That's also why we can use contractors from our emergency response program to do that. We also reviewed public notification plans. We were involved in those discussions as to what was going to be said and when, really making sure that the utilities on both sides of the river were consistent in their messaging, because this does get confusing, as was mentioned by Sam. A lot of folks don't know where their water comes from. So one of the I should mention, I think one of the best things that happened during this spill was that Aqua stepped up and said, we can use our laboratory, we'll run GC mass spec, you bring us samples, we'll run them. Philadelphia Water took samples to them, so did New Jersey American. And as I mentioned, we would know when results were going to be coming in, and our conference calls were scheduled shortly thereafter so we could share results. So in this case, the Pennsylvania WARN was not formally activated, and it doesn't need to be. The utilities came together to support one another, which was really great to see. They discussed their notification plans for consistency. They all did a conservation order early on. I can tell you from past spills I've been involved with, you never know how long these things are going to last. You never know if they're going to get worse before they get better. And I think the utilities are learning that as well. And that's why they wanted the conservation order to go out soon, as soon as they could get it out, because that it should help to save water in storage. It gives them more preparation time. And some of you may be aware that there was frequent notification by Philly Water, and I can explain that a little bit more. So I also wanted to mention EPA's regional lab. They were not actively involved in this spill. Had there been a request from a state or another local jurisdiction to assist. We could have stood up the lab, brought people in to do analyses. But in this case, we had the support of Aqua, we had the Coast Guard picking up samples, the responsible party taking samples to Edison. So we didn't feel there was additional need. However, because the sampling results that were coming in were all non-detect, these were GC mass spec samples analysis, and by Monday morning, we were just questioning, are we missing something? Do we have the correct method for these contaminants? So I reached out to the lab and had those discussions to confirm, yes, given what the material was, we should have seen it in the way the samples were being run with the analyses. So we had more confidence in the non-detects. A couple other things I wanted to mention before I end. We had great support from the responsible party, I think, in explaining more about the material. That was very useful in this response. We also had a great support among the utilities. And as I mentioned, a lot of folks don't know the source of their water. I actually live in New Jersey. Easy commuting distance over to Philadelphia. My small community issued a text to residents that said we were not affected by this river spill because we use wells to serve water in my community. There were a number of communities across South Jersey who were doing the same thing. I got a few phone calls from people who knew I worked in the drinking water program at EPA to ask me if their water system was impacted. And in every one of those cases, they were not. They were not part of receiving water from New Jersey American, and they were not on the Aqua or the Philadelphia system. So it was complicated, I think, for the public to understand in that respect, because the river's right here. A lot of folks know that it's used for drinking water, but again, folks don't necessarily know specifically where their water is coming from. And because they weren't hearing from their water utility that things were fine, there was a bit of panic. By Saturday afternoon, most of the local stores did not have bottled water. Much of that stems from the frequent notifications that Philly Water was doing. They knew if they had taken a raw water sample, how long it would take that particular water from the raw water basin to go through their treatment process, roughly 24 hours. And they also knew that once they had those results, they could say to folks, the water's safe to drink, and we'll let you know, they were giving time frames, which may not have been the best approach for them. They would say things like, the water will be safe to drink until 2 p.m. They also included in their press release and in their news conference that if there was any concern on the part of the public, they may want to use bottled water. That created a run on bottled water. And unfortunately, there were no other efforts put in place to provide water to folks who couldn't get out to get water. There was no coordination with larger users. And there may not have needed to be, but the messaging was confusing to folks. I also know that I've never seen so much bottled water in the local grocery stores when this happened, even though my community was not affected. And the surrounding communities were also not affected. So I go back to some of the lessons learned that Sam spoke of earlier. Communication, I think it was great between the emergency responders and the drinking water program at the states and with utilities. Some of the public messaging could have been improved, and that's always difficult to do. And with that, I'm going to share my contact. Oh, I didn't put my contact information in here. I know that Christina has it, but I thank you very much for allowing me to join the meeting, and I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Patty Kay. Appreciate that. We're running a little behind, so if anyone has questions, put them in the chat. Patty Kay, can you see the chat? And
I can.
all right. and then we can address those there. But Christy, otherwise, I was thinking we would just move on with the agenda if that's okay with you.
Certainly. Thank you.
All right. Next up is Laura Casillas. I apologize if I messed up your last name, Laura. She is the EPA on-site coordinator for EPA Region 3 in the National Capital Region, and she's going to talk to us about some of the things that she does and what EPA does. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good morning. I apologize. My voice is a little bit rough today. Can you guys see my presentation?
I am not able to see it, Laura.
Give me
I don't
one
know
sec.
if Christy has it where she can upload it if you're having trouble uploading it.
Renee, do you see the share button at the bottom, Laura? So mute, start video, and then to the right of that is share.
Yeah. Okay.
So if you press share and then you can select which screen.
Okay. I think I chose wrong. Give me a second. Okay.
Renee, do you
Can
want?
share my screen if that would be easier. Is that what you prefer, Laura?
Maybe.
Looks like you have it up.
I apologize. So, okay. There we go.
There we go. That's up. Perfect.
Got it? Okay. Sorry about that. So good afternoon. My name is Laura Casillas. I'd like to show you my face, but I'm afraid I'll break this whole thing down. So my role is I work with Patty Kay and EPA Region 3. My role is more in the response world and federal on-scene coordinator. Our role is more in the Superfund program. We respond to emergencies, but we also support a lot of planning and preparedness work. And today I just wanted to cover really briefly a little bit of the background, like the jurisdictions we operate under, the legal authorizations we operate under, what that looks like to you, how we might support you indirectly. At the end of the day, we are not a water authority. Whenever we have drinking water or wastewater related questions, we always reach out to Patty Kay's group. Thanks to Patty Kay for always being so available and knowledgeable, and her whole team, really. My background, I've been a responder for about 20 years. I went on to work in our EPA's headquarters as our national exercise coordinator, and I've done a lot of the projects that they weren't the coolest, but they allowed me to have a lot of experience with training and capability building, which is something I really enjoy. And I think it's a good fit to work with you guys. Thanks for having me on board. I am now assigned as, after I worked at EPA headquarters, I went to Coast Guard. I worked with our marine emergency response policy. Then I came back, but now I'm here in the role of an on-scene coordinator that is specifically assigned to the National Capital Region. I'll talk to you a little bit about how Region 3 does it. We have an entire group that is divided up into sub-regions or sub-areas so that we can develop better relationships with our local authorities or water authorities or health departments, whoever it may be. And then finally, I'll talk about a few opportunities that I see in the National Capital Region for us to work together. So bottom line is the core of the work that we do comes through the National Contingency Plan, its delegations, and the Oil Pollution Act. I won't get into all of this because I'm not trying to put you to sleep. But really, as long we have to work within the parameters of these regulations and laws, so that, you know, we're legal. But it does give the role of the on-scene coordinator a lot of authority to do a lot of work quickly. And that is sometimes very different and unexpected role that EPA plays. A lot of people come out expecting us to do enforcement most of the time or regulatory work, but this role of response is one in which we actually can come in with our own funding as long as it meets certain criteria. And we can actually come in with our own contractors, conduct sampling, conduct the actual cleanup. We have our own earth moving contracts, our own some construction we can do, remediation technology we can do. And our focus in the emergency program is obviously cleanups that are shorter in nature. We focus on oil and hazmat cleanups in the National Capital Region, specifically the states and locals. They have a lot of resources. They have a lot of experience and a lot of capability when it comes to responding. So some of the times that we might step in are when these resources are, for any reason, exceeded, right? And maybe it's a bigger cleanup than they expected or that they currently can handle. So we are able to step in and support. We work with responsible parties, facilities, to either ensure that they are conducting the cleanup appropriately, or if they cannot conduct the cleanup for whatever reason, we can step in and do the cleanup for them. One important thing to keep in mind, and one of the things that I'd like to cover in the future as we work together, is we do share a responsibility with Coast Guard, right? EPA and Coast Guard both have on-scene coordinators that can take on the role of a response. However, we have a memorandum in which Coast Guard handles, you know, obviously they handle a coastal zone, but sometimes their zones go into, you know, up the Potomac quite a ways, up a little bit north of Georgetown. And our memorandum of understanding details exactly where, I don't mean for you to read all this, but it does like break it down very specifically into what their zone, you know, where their zone ends, where ours begins, like road by road. And the reason for this is, you know, just to have clarity of who has ultimate jurisdiction over various areas. Sometimes a response can obviously flow from one jurisdiction to another, and that is an important topic to discuss as we are addressing issues that impact waterways. Because as you know, further up the Potomac, you know, that might be an EPA zone. And as we get closer to the DC area, that becomes Coast Guard. So it's just an extra layer of coordination that we have to keep in mind. And that's something we kind of handle, you know, with Coast Guard on our own. Most important thing to take from this, if there's a spill, either hazmat or oil, you can call the 1-800-424-8802 to report it. Most of you, I'm sure, are already familiar with this. Both Coast Guard and EPA have funding that goes into the National Response Center. We make sure that the center is staffed 24 hours a day. Coast Guard mainly manages it staff-wise, and then we share the reports, as I'm sure many of you have seen. This is a way for us to really maintain a kind of a consistent reporting and consistent collection of information when a report comes in, and it gives us a way to coordinate with our local counterparts and make sure they've received it and reach out and offer support if needed. I mentioned that Region 3 is divided into sub areas. Over here in the orange one, this would be mine, and this, for this group, you guys may be concerned with the area number 10 and 2 for us. You might be working with two different on-scene coordinators, which may be myself and Don McLaughlin further upstream towards the Virginia area, Harpers Ferry. However, that shouldn't matter. You can call either of us anytime you need any help. Some of the resources that EPA brings in, if needed, we have our environmental response team. They have people much smarter than myself who can, they can run spectrometers. They have real-time air monitoring devices. Depending on the situation, we can support a response. We have teams that are more focused on the terrorism side of things with chemical weapons and consequence management, radiation experts. And we also have the capability to support law enforcement if there is a need to safeguard samples in such a way that they need to be, processed for their needs. We also tap into the Coast Guard's National Strike Force. They tend to have more of a larger scale equipment for pumping water. Like if you're in a situation where you need to pump a lot of water, they have some really great tools for that, boats and that such, and those tools. In addition to air monitoring equipment, really good industrial hygienists on call. It's a great resource. I mentioned and Patty Kay also mentioned our contractor support when it comes down to an actual response. I'm about an hour away from the center of DC. Our contractors can be on site sometime between 2 to 4 hours for sampling in various levels of personal protective equipment. And depending on what the material is, we can bring the relevant sampling tools. I won't read all this, but we have broad roles that we can fill. Not only can we assist law enforcement with sampling, we can assist OSHA with safeguarding the safety of responders. We have sites that are small mercury spills where they tend to, it's possible that people can spread it through walking through a contaminated area. Those tend to be smaller. Sometimes they can get pretty big. To train derailments, as you heard earlier. A lot of the work that I've been doing in the DC area has to do with vapor intrusion assessments. A lot of former dry cleaners have been converted to daycares or other uses without proper follow-up or cleanup. And so there's a lot of assessment work to be done there. On the terrorism side, our group did work with DC Capitol Police during the ricin and anthrax attacks on Capitol Hill, developing a decontamination plan and a whole plan for sampling and making sure that things were clean and safe. Overall, I spent a lot of my time supporting law enforcement in the DC area with national security events. And sometimes, if necessary, we will pre-deploy teams with some monitoring equipment ahead of time if it's a big enough event. Things like the presidential address, things like that. Other things we do is, this was an example of a site where we did sampling for Metropolitan Police and our own criminal investigation division to support an investigation of illegally applied pesticides, the actual cleanup of the poorly applied pesticides, oil, dry cleaners. There was up on H Street a few years ago, there was a train derailment. We supported with air monitoring around the area and things like that. So I tried to hurry through it. Overall, over the next by 2025, I would like to have what we call our sub-area plan updated. It's been about 10 years since it's been updated. And one of my efforts is to reach out and I have a little bit of money set aside for some exercises. I'd like to ground truth elements of that plan. For example, areas where it says that we can access rivers, or where we can deploy oil containment boom from, or other equipment from. I would like to slowly ground truth all those spots in the plan, and I have been working on getting to know my counterparts at the local level, like health departments, water facilities, others of fire departments, and go through our plan and make sure that it's up to date. And if you have any interest in working with that with us, feel free to reach out. Here's my contact information. I know some of us have been discussing an exercise for the end of October. Are there any questions for me, or I can take them offline since we're kind of behind?
Thank you, Laura. I really appreciate that and the contact information. And I'm glad your voice held up. So if we don't mind, I'd like to do the questions in the chat if anyone has questions, just to try and get us back on schedule. We have one more presentation, and then we were planning on doing the updates portion. So if that's okay with you, Laura, we'll just go to the chat. Are you okay with that?
Oh, good. Thank you.
Yep. All right. Thank you. Next up, we're going to talk about the Colonial Pipeline, and Sherry Schultz is the director for the co-op operations for ICPRB. She has a PhD in physics from Stony Brook University, a master's degree in civil engineering from the University of Maryland, and a BS in physics from Stanford. So I'll turn it over to you. Thank you. And Sherry, if you're speaking, we cannot hear you.
Sorry, hard to find all the controls here. Can you hear me now?
Yes, you are good to go. Thank you.
Okay, great. So this is a fairly brief presentation. I might be able to make up some time. I want to talk about, after hearing some pretty scary events that have happened recently and the great support that we get from the EPA, I just wanted, this is a retrospective about something that happened 30 years ago. I was asked to put this together last March by one of our commissioners because it's basically the 30-year anniversary of this event. And he asked me to particularly focus on what's the same and what's changed. So this was a rupture in the Colonial pipeline, and it impacted DC metropolitan area water supply. First, just a synopsis of the event. Again, the rupture occurred in March 1993, and over 400,000 gallons of number two fuel oil were released. Locally, oil flowed into a small tributary of the Potomac River named Sugarland Run, and then into the river itself. The rupture was attributed to damage from a 1986 construction activity, but if you pore over the historical documents, wasn't great certainty on exactly what had caused the damage that eventually caused this rupture. At that time, there were about $25 million in cleanup costs, a settlement in 1998 involving the US, DC, and Virginia. You see in this map, the Colonial pipeline, which runs from Houston all the way up to New York City. And this pipeline, it seems, was built by a consortium of oil companies, and it carries different products from day to day. And it crosses the Potomac River just upstream of all of our major intakes. Just upstream of the water supply, the main water supply of Washington, D.C. and the surrounding suburbs. Also crosses tributaries that discharge into the river just upstream of the intakes. It also crosses tributaries that discharge into the Occoquan watershed and the Patuxent watershed. Those are tributaries to two major secondary sources for our region. So people have gone through timelines about spills that have occurred recently, and there was enough historical information for me to put together a timeline for the Colonial spill. None of us currently at ICPRB were around at that time, but I'm on the ICPRB spill team. Like Orsenko, we're a fairly small organization, between 15 and 20 people. There's about 6 of us on the spill team. I echo what Patty Kay said. Spills almost always occur late Friday, but I don't think the Colonial spill was on a late Friday evening. So I was really curious about the timeline. I was thinking, how would this have played out today? What would we have been doing on the spill team? So here's the timeline, and the lesson here is things happen incredibly fast, because this pipeline is just above all the intakes. So at 8:48 in the morning, Colonial Pipeline operators noticed pressure drops, and they shut pumps and valves at 2 of their stations. They have a station in Chantilly, Virginia, and a station in Woodbine, Maryland. These 2 stations are separated by about 45 miles. So they shut the valves at those 2 stations, and that still left, or 35 miles, that still left 35 miles of oil in the pipeline. At about 9 a.m., a police officer observed a geyser of oil behind the Reston Hospital Center, a 50 to 100-foot geyser. At 9:20, the county, this is a pretty populated area, of course, 9:20, the Fairfax County hazmat team arrived. So people were on the scene very shortly. Colonial manually shut 2 local valves on either side of the Potomac River. So they had to drive out and shut these 2 valves at 9:30 and 10:22. So this shutdown stopped the spill. But petroleum did enter. Oh, I guess I wanted to show on the map where the spill was at the Reston Hospital Center. The petroleum product did enter quickly a small tributary of the Potomac called Sugarland Run. Fairfax Water, the closest downstream intake, about 1.5 miles downstream of the mouth of Sugarland Run. They were informed at 10:20, but they were told at that time that this spill would be contained. At about 12:25, they drove to the Route 7 bridge over Sugarland Run, and they observed the plume. And their judgment was, no, this spill was not going to be contained. So the plume hit the mouth of Sugarland Run in early evening. Fairfax Water now was ready to shut down their intakes. By 7 p.m., booms had been deployed at 6 spill control locations on Sugarland Run. 150-person crew with 8 tanker trucks, 5 vacuum trucks were on the scene. Hazmat people were containing this spill. And at 7:45, Fairfax Water closed their water supply intake due to arrival of oil. So here are the location of the Potomac River intakes. On the Virginia side of the river, that's the southwestern side of the river, is Fairfax Water. On the Maryland side of the river, WSSC Water, the town of Rockville, and the Washington Aqueduct are located. And so these intakes provide water for about 78% of the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. The impacts, so we'll stop the blow-by-blow timeline, but the impacts lasted for weeks. Fairfax Water's Potomac intake was shut down continuously for 11 days. And then later for 2 more days because the oil was remobilized because of a rain event. They were able to manage. They have an intake on the Occoquan Reservoir, and they were able to serve their customers by shifting to the Occoquan Reservoir. That would no longer be possible. Their demand has grown too much, and they now do rely on their Potomac intake for a portion of their demand. Of course, there were environmental and recreational impacts, severe impacts to Sugarland Run, fish, benthic macroinvertebrates, riparian wildlife, fumes at national parklands in Washington, D.C. and downstream drove away visitors, drove away staff from the parks. Pockets of oil were detected as far down as Quantico in the Potomac estuary. This was a big deal. There were hearings and studies. You can still find a transcript of hearings from the House Subcommittee on Investigations and Oversight online. That took place May 18th, 1993. And at that hearing, that the current director of co-op, the Section for Cooperative Water Supply Operations on the Potomac, that's my position at the moment, that was Stu Schwartz at that time. He testified before the House Subcommittee. There was a restoration plan, environmental assessment by the Department of Interior, Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, the DC Department of Health in 1999. You can find that online. The National Transportation Safety Board did a special investigation report, and that came out in 2002. So you can read about the spill and the findings in those documents. So when I was asked to give this presentation, the focus was supposed to be on what's changed. You know, could this happen again? Have there been improvements, or are we just as vulnerable as we were before? So there have been changes in pipeline safety regulations. Pipeline integrity monitoring via smart pigs and other methods. Before 1993, these were recommended, but not mandatory. There were some changes in regulation mandating more pipeline assessments in 2000. A shutoff valve spacing. That was an issue in the Potomac. If you remember, there were automatic shutoff valves spaced 35 miles apart. So that left a lot of product in the pipeline to spill into the river. There were recommendations on valve spacing before 1993. There are now new requirements in 2022. It's not clear if anything has changed for the Colonial pipeline. I pored over these new requirements, and they look good, but there are a lot of caveats. There are ways you can circumvent the requirements. So we don't quite know what's happened with the Colonial pipeline. Installation of remote valve control. This was recommended before 1993. Remember, there were 2 manually operated valves on either side of the river, and once those were shut, the release pretty much ceased. There are new requirements in 2022. We don't quite know what's happened to our pipeline. And I think the most important thing was the regulations require that unusually sensitive areas be designated. They're defined, and they include drinking water sources without adequate alternative supply. And certainly that is the case for us. I remember when I was involved in the partnership probably 15 years ago, we had a lot of conversations with Colonial, and they had not designated us as an unusually sensitive area. I don't know if that has changed now, but it's certainly worth finding out. Changes in regional communications, of course, as you can imagine. ICPRB spill team, we get notifications after 1993. Co-op staff started carrying around a 24/7 beeper. And if someone went on vacation, they had to get somebody else to take charge of the beeper. Of course, things have improved a lot. In 2010, ICPRB started using an answering service, and that service calls members of the spill team until somebody answers. And also, communications have obviously been transformed. In the early years, it was telephone. In 2016, ICPRB instituted groups.io listserv, Potomac spills at groups.io. And that's turned out to be really helpful. We've had changes in our time of travel tools. So the main thing ICPRB spill team does is run our spill models to determine or estimate or guesstimate the time of arrival of spills at downstream water supply intakes. And we've made major advances, I think, in our spill modeling. And we, of course, notify downstream intakes about our travel time estimates. We now do this through the listserv. So before starting in 1985, ICPRB had a one-dimensional computer model for dissolved contaminants. We call that the emergency response spill model. In the early 2000s, some of us started using river spill, and that was a model funded by EPA and other federal agencies. It's now morphed into something called IC Water, and we still use IC Water. It's, again, a one-dimensional tool for dissolved contaminants, but we apply results. We would apply the results to oil spills because it was the only tool we had. And there's a new tool by Corona, a consulting firm supported by COG, called WaterSuite. It's another 1D tool. We decided there was a need for a two-dimensional computer model of floating contaminants. That's because in the 93 spill, the oil hugged the Virginia side of the river and only shut down Fairfax water. It did not migrate to the Maryland side of the river. It did not shut down Washington Aqueduct or Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission's intakes. So a two-dimensional model with 2D flows is really needed, or we thought would help us understand why this happened and whether there's risks in future spills of migration across the river. So we now have a 2D oil spill model. Alima Tusek, who I know is on the call, has been building these models. We're using the NOAA's NOME oil transport model, and she has a model of the Patuxent Reservoir, the Occoquan Reservoir, and most recently, the Potomac River main stem. So this is, of course, a model for floating contaminants. It's usually used in the ocean, but we are using it in a free-flowing river, and that is the case in a few other locations. Most recently, Alima 2 built a two-dimensional flow model to drive the NOME model, and that's for the Potomac main stem. That was made possible because of a USGS ICPRB project to collect very detailed bathymetric LIDAR data for the Potomac main stem. So she actually has a draft manuscript that she's finishing up right now on the results of using this 2D flow model to simulate the 93 oil spill. And indeed, she finds that the oil did hug the Virginia side of the river. It did adhere to the side of the river, and then it was remobilized during higher flows. So we think this will be a great tool for the future. So finally, changes in mitigation strategy. We're continue to be really vulnerable to a release from the Colonial pipeline. A release could happen. Last time the release happened into a tributary, and at least there were 8 hours or so to prepare for it, 8 or more hours. If the release happened directly into the Potomac River, there'd be 0 time to shut intakes. That would be pretty disastrous. There's a lot of vulnerability because unlike most major metropolitan areas, we do not have enough secondary water supply. We've been talking about this and trying to raise awareness. The District of Columbia and Arlington, which are served by the Washington Aqueduct, would completely run out of water after 1 day. They only really have 1 day of reservoir storage. That's something we're trying to address, but terrible vulnerability there. It looks like would shut down their intakes if oil were at the intakes. WSSC water is quite vulnerable. If oil arrived at their intakes after several days, a good portion of their customers would be without water. And the same is now true for Fairfax Water. After several days, a good portion of their customers would be without water. The Occoquan Reservoir and the Patuxent reservoirs and their associated treatment plants are not big enough to supply all of their customer base. So we've got to do something about this. We know that. The region's been working since 2014. The co-op suppliers supported a feasibility study for using a local quarry as a secondary source of water. The Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments conducted a resiliency study focused on emergency events such as spills in 2016. My Section Co-op conducted a water supply alternative study that was actually focused on severe drought, drought more severe than in the past because of climate change. But both studies indicated that this potential facility at Travilla Quarry would mitigate the risk. The U.S. Corps of Engineers conducted a value planning study. They're very much aware of this. In 2021, ICPRB initiated outreach to Congress to make sure that they were aware of this risk and this vulnerability. And just last year, the 2022 Water Resources and Development Act authorized the Corps to conduct a feasibility study on a secondary water source for our region to address vulnerabilities both to spills and climate change. And lastly, what do we see as the needs and next steps? Of course, exercises are our first line of defense. An exercise using ICPRB's at least one of our 2D oil spill modeling tools would be valuable, and I think that's going to happen coming up this fall. It's probably time to engage again with Colonial Pipeline and with the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration to learn about changes in our region since 1993. It's not clear exactly what changes Colonial has implemented. There was a past bill that we did use as a method of engaging Colonial, so maybe a bigger spill engaging Colonial would be valuable. As far as response, our 2D rivers Potomac main stem spill model is really a fairly preliminary model. We need to set it up as real time so that we could be there immediately simulating a spill event, so that we could be useful to inform downstream intakes. And finally, in mitigation, we're in an incredibly vulnerable region, so we need to keep working on implementing supplemental storage for the region. There are some lower cost measures that would help out with spills in the Corps' value planning study, and perhaps, and there have been some efforts to find funding for some of these lower cost measures. Anyway, that's what happened 30 years ago, and certainly a lot of lessons about vulnerabilities today from that event. Thank you.